The Gravedigger's Lament. Back in 1963, Greenwood Cemetery sat quietly on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Vermont, surrounded by tall maples that cast eerie shadows under the moonlight. It was the kind of place folks whispered about, the kind that kids dared each other to run through after dark. Thomas Eldridge had been the caretaker there for over 20 years, a respected but somewhat peculiar man who mostly kept to himself. He lived in a small, worn cottage at the far end of the cemetery grounds, isolated from the rest of town. Thomas didn't talk much to anyone, except when absolutely necessary, spending his days meticulously tending graves, pulling weeds, and polishing weathered tombstones. Everyone knew him simply as the gravekeeper, a mysterious but harmless figure quietly passing through life, surrounded by silence. But that year, something shifted. Folks in town started noticing Thomas acting different. He'd mumble to himself, stopping suddenly during his daily chores as if someone was calling him from afar. One evening in late October, as he shoveled earth from a freshly dug grave, he stopped abruptly, frozen in place as though someone had just whispered his name. Eyewitnesses, mostly teenagers sneaking into the cemetery at night, swore they'd seen Thomas shouting into the darkness, yelling at the headstones, as if arguing with invisible tormentors. The whole town began murmuring stories about Thomas losing his mind. Then, without warning or explanation, Thomas Eldridge simply vanished. His cottage was found empty, supper left half-eaten on the table, and his tools scattered across the floor, as though he had rushed out in a sudden panic, never to return. As the years passed, the story of Thomas Eldridge became nothing more than a local legend. The cemetery itself, once a place of peace, grew more unsettling with each passing year. People started saying that on certain nights, if you stood near the graveyard long enough, you could hear faint whispers, carried by the wind. It was always the same, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Those who were brave enough to walk through the cemetery at night said they could sometimes catch a glimpse of an old man, bent over in the distance, tirelessly digging graves under the pale light of the moon. But when they called out to him or tried to approach, he'd vanish in an instant, leaving behind only the sound of shuffling dirt and the lingering smell of freshly disturbed soil. It wasn't long before people began to notice the unmarked graves. Freshly dug soil appeared overnight, in places where no one had been buried for decades. At first it seemed like an odd but harmless quirk of the cemetery. Maybe a prankster, maybe an overzealous maintenance worker, anything but a ghostly figure haunting the land. But as weeks went by and the graves continued to appear, the whispers grew louder. Those who had dared to venture into the cemetery after dark said they had seen him, an elderly man hunched over, digging furiously with a shovel that creaked with every thrust into the ground. His features were obscured by shadow, but something about the way he moved struck a chill into the bones of those who saw him. The worst part? He never seemed to acknowledge their presence. He would continue digging, lost in some strange, unspoken task. And when anyone tried to approach, he was gone, vanishing into thin air just as quickly as he had appeared. At first, I thought it was just another ghost story, something to thrill the younger crowd, or to explain the eerie feeling that had started to hang over the cemetery. But then it happened to me. I'd been working late one autumn evening, helping my father with some grave markers that needed resetting. It was past midnight when I saw it, the figure. He wasn't far from me, digging in the dirt with deliberate, measured strokes. The moonlight caught his grey hair, and for a split second, I thought it was Thomas. Eldridge himself returned to finish the work he'd started all those years ago, but something wasn't right. The man moved too slowly, his body unnaturally stiff. The air around him seemed heavy, like the space was pressing in on me. As I stepped forward to call out, a sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, and when I blinked, he was gone. Just like that. No trace, no footprints, just empty earth. Paragraph 6. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just fatigue, maybe even a trick of the light. But that feeling, the cold dread, didn't leave. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the grave, the one he'd been working on when I saw him. It was still there, freshly dug, but no name had been etched into the stone. It was just a blank slab, as if it had been waiting for something. I couldn't help myself. I came back that night, just to check, just to see if maybe I was mistaken. But when I arrived, the grave had changed. The soil was disturbed even more, as if someone had been digging deeper. And again, there he was, that same old man hunched over his work. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I was only a few steps away, he turned. I could finally see his face. His eyes were hollow, dark as pits, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, making him look more like a corpse than a living person. Then, just as before, he vanished, leaving nothing but the sickening feeling of being watched. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, constantly haunted by the memory of his face, those eyes, cold and lifeless. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the old man had been a caretaker who'd passed away and his spirit couldn't find peace. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more the whispers grew louder. They came every night, that same hushed murmuring, always coming from deep within the cemetery. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong with Greenwood Cemetery, something dark and ancient. I knew I had to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting whatever was haunting the place. I went to the local library and dug through old newspapers, searching for anything about Thomas Eldridge's disappearance. The more I read, the more disturbing the details became. The town had never recovered from his sudden vanishing. No one knew where he went, but the rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed they saw him wandering in the woods. Others believed he had simply lost his mind and disappeared into the wilderness. But there was something else. A small, cryptic article from 1963 caught my attention. It mentioned strange occurrences at the cemetery shortly before Thomas's disappearance, unexplained sounds, whispers at night, and the unsettling feeling that something was lurking beneath the earth. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It seemed that the whispers had always been there, even before Thomas's disappearance. But why had they started again, after all these years? What was it that had driven him mad, and why was it still happening now? That night, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to go back to Greenwood. It was just me and the darkness, the quiet of the cemetery broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and as I walked between the rows of headstones, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the cemetery anymore. It was something in the ground, in the very soil beneath my feet. I made my way to the same grave I'd seen the old man digging at, and sure enough, there it was, the freshly disturbed earth. But this time something was different. The grave hadn't been filled in. The hole was deeper now, much deeper, and I could see the faint outline of something buried far beneath. My heart raced. I had to know what was down there, what had been calling to me all this time. I didn't think about it. I just started digging. With every shovel full, the unease inside me grew, but I couldn't stop. The whispers, though faint at first, grew louder as I dug deeper until they became a constant hum in my ears, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. Then suddenly the shovel struck something solid. My hands shook as I cleared the dirt away, revealing an old weathered wooden box. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just any old coffin. It was ancient. The wood was cracked and rotting, and something about it felt wrong. I hesitated for only a moment before I pried it open. The moment I lifted the lid, I wished I hadn't. Inside was a body, but not just any body. It was Thomas Eldridge himself. His skin had withered and decayed, but his eyes, they were wide open, staring at me with that same hollow, lifeless gaze. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the grave as my mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. How was it possible? Thomas Eldridge was supposed to have disappeared years ago, but here he was, rotting in front of me, still clutching a tattered old journal in his hands. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached for it. As my fingers brushed against the cold, brittle pages, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to scream at me from within the earth. I flipped the journal open, my heart hammering in my chest as I read his final entry. The words were frantic, almost illegible, but I could make out enough to understand he had been driven mad by the whispers that told him to keep digging, to unearth something that should have stayed buried. But the more he dug, the more he heard them, and the deeper the madness went, until he could no longer tell where the voices ended and his own thoughts began. Before I could process it, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I turned, my blood turning to ice. There, standing at the edge of the grave, was the old man, the one I had seen digging. But this time he wasn't vanishing. He was closer now, too close, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing hum of whispers. "You've awakened it." I could barely breathe, my mind reeling. The ground beneath me trembled, and in the distance I heard the sound of digging, countless shovels moving in rhythm. It wasn't just Thomas. It never had been. And as I looked back down at the body in the grave, I realized with a sinking feeling that I was now part of it. The whispers were waiting for me. The digging would never stop. The girl of Maple Avenue. It was the summer of 1974 when Elizabeth Hawthorne, a 16-year-old runaway, disappeared without a trace. She was the kind of girl who kept to herself, one of those quiet teens who wandered the streets of town like she didn't quite belong. She had lived a hard life, bouncing between foster homes, always keeping her head low and her eyes distant. On the day she vanished, she was last seen near the old Greenwood cemetery on Maple Avenue. The sun was setting, and the air was thick with the sticky humidity of late June. Elizabeth was seen walking barefoot along the cemetery's wrought iron fence, her long, tangled hair fluttering in the breeze, a soft hum escaping her lips, almost like she was singing to herself. But no one could tell you what happened after that. Some thought she had simply run away again, but the strange feeling of something more sinister began to hang in the air, thickening with each passing day. As weeks stretched into months, the town of Maple Avenue tried to move on, but Elizabeth's absence left a hole that couldn't be filled. The police were baffled, and her family, or what was left of it, never got the answers they needed. But it wasn't the lack of closure that troubled the townspeople the most. It was what began happening around the cemetery. Locals started reporting sightings of a girl, always around twilight, walking barefoot along the cemetery fence, humming the same soft lullaby Elizabeth had been known to hum in her youth. It was never loud, never enough to make someone stop in their tracks, but it was always there, like a haunting presence that lingered just out of reach. Those who saw her swore that she was the spitting image of Elizabeth, her vacant eyes staring straight ahead as she moved slowly through the shadows. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she would disappear into the growing darkness, as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The town was never quite the same after that, and neither were the people who'd seen her. The whispers about Elizabeth's ghost began to spread, thickening the already murky air around Greenwood Cemetery. I was never one to believe in ghosts or spirits. I had grown up hearing all sorts of stories about the cemetery, the strange noises at night, the odd flickers of light from the old mausoleums, and of course the sightings of Elizabeth. I never gave it much thought, dismissing it as the imagination of small-town folk who had nothing better to do. But that changed one evening in late September. I was walking home from the diner after my shift, cutting through the old cemetery like I always did to save time. The air was crisp, the sky a fading shade of pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, and that's when I saw her. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dying light, but as I got closer, there she Was Elizabeth Hawthorne, just as described by everyone. She was humming, her bare feet dragging slowly across the grass, her head slightly tilted as if lost in a world of her own. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I wanted to call out, but something stopped me, something in her stillness, in the way she moved that felt too unnatural. I don't know how long I stood there watching her. It felt like an eternity, but also just a blink of time. Elizabeth's eyes never shifted, never acknowledged my presence, yet I could feel the weight of her gaze as though she was staring right through me. Her humming grew softer, barely a whisper carried on the wind. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, like a wisp of smoke fading into nothingness. I ran the rest of the way home, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? People had been seeing her for months, and yet no one had the courage to speak out. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something beyond explanation. Something was pulling Elizabeth back to that cemetery, something that wasn't just tied to her life, but to the very earth beneath those graves. Whatever had claimed her years ago hadn't let go. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't the last to see her. The days after that night were strange. I kept seeing Elizabeth's face in every shadow, hearing her lullaby in the quiet moments of my day, like an echo in the back of my mind. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus. Every time I passed the cemetery, I felt her presence there, lurking just beyond the gate, waiting for me to look. It wasn't long before I started to hear other stories, whispers from people I didn't even know. There was a man who worked at the local gas station, a guy named Joe, who claimed to have seen her too, just a week after I had. He had been closing up for the night when he spotted her, walking along the fence. He said he called out to her, but she never stopped. The strangest part, he said the air around her felt cold, colder than it should have been for a late summer evening. And when he tried to approach her, she just faded, like she was being swallowed by the cemetery itself. It was becoming clear that the sightings weren't isolated. Elizabeth wasn't just a figment of the town's collective imagination. She was real, and whatever had taken her wasn't done with her yet. I didn't know what to do. The more I heard, the more I realized that Elizabeth's disappearance had never been an accident, not like the police had said. It wasn't just a runaway case, and it wasn't something as simple as a girl getting lost. I had to know what had happened to her, what had kept her bound to that cemetery, walking barefoot in the twilight hours. One evening I went back. The sun had set and the town was quiet, save for the rustling of the trees in the breeze. I stood near the entrance of Greenwood Cemetery, watching the last bits of light fade into darkness. It was then that I heard it. The soft, haunting hum, barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. The unmistakable sound of Elizabeth's lullaby. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I had to see it again. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting something that no one else dared to. I stepped into the cemetery, my feet sinking into the grass, and I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, and there at the far end I saw her again, her figure just beyond the shadows, still humming. But this time there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. Her face was different. There was a look in her eyes, something dark, something that didn't belong to the innocent girl who had once wandered the streets. As I stepped closer, the air around me seemed to freeze. The humming stopped. Elizabeth's figure didn't move, but her eyes, their gaze was fixed on me now, no longer vacant but sharp, aware. They seemed to pierce through me, as if she could see into the deepest parts of my soul. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Her skin, once pale and delicate, now appeared almost translucent, faint streaks of blue veins running beneath the surface. Her hair, disheveled and wild, fluttered lightly, but there was no breeze. She was standing still, Yet the whole scene felt alive with a sense of unnatural tension. I wanted to call out to her, to ask if she needed help, but my voice was lost in the thick silence. Elizabeth slowly lifted her hand, pointing toward the farthest corner of the cemetery, where a cluster of old, forgotten graves stood in disrepair. My heart raced. Something in my gut told me to run, but I couldn't move, not with her eyes locked on mine. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in some eerie, unspoken exchange. My feet felt rooted to the spot, and the weight of her gaze pressed harder against my chest with every passing second. Then, without warning, Elizabeth turned, slowly, deliberately, and began walking toward the neglected graves. Her feet didn't make a sound, the grass not even bending under her weight. She was gliding, moving with an unnatural grace, her pale form fading into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. I wanted to scream, to warn her to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stumbled after her, compelled by something I couldn't understand. She reached the gravestones, pausing before one that had been weathered by years of neglect. She knelt, running her fingers over the cracked stone as if in mourning, her voice barely a whisper. "They never let me leave," she said, her voice cold and hollow, sending a shiver down my spine. "They won't let me leave." My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back. The cemetery, once so familiar, now felt like a prison. Its oppressive silence almost suffocating. Elizabeth's words hung in the air, as if the very ground beneath me could swallow them whole. "Who won't let you leave?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. Her head turned just slightly, and though her face was pale, there was a twisted sadness in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't speak again, but her fingers traced the surface of the gravestone one last time before she stood. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, as if she were deciding something. Then, without a word, she slowly turned and started walking toward me. The humming began again, soft and haunting, but this time it wasn't a lullaby. It was something darker, something that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. I backed away, my pulse quickening as the cold air wrapped around me like a shroud. Elizabeth's figure was moving faster now, closing the distance between us with unnatural speed. Her once gentle hum had become a low, almost guttural sound, a dissonant melody that made my skin crawl. Her eyes, no longer empty but filled with something ancient, something desperate, fixed on me. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice now laced with an eerie warning. "You'll never leave." I turned and ran, panic flooding my every step, but no matter how fast I moved, the cemetery seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees, the gravestones, the shadows, everything closing in. I could still hear her behind me, that humming, that dreadful lullaby, as though the cemetery itself was alive, chasing me, pulling me back toward it. It wasn't until I reached the gate that I dared to look back, and when I did, she was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the lingering echo of her song and the oppressive feeling that she was still watching me. Next few days were a blur. I tried to tell myself that what had happened was just a hallucination, some trick of the mind brought on by fear, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth was still out there, waiting for something. The town had always whispered about Greenwood Cemetery, about the strange things that happened after dark, but I never fully understood until I felt it myself. The pull of something far darker than a restless spirit. Every night, I couldn't help but look out my window, half expecting to see her figure walking along the cemetery fence, humming that dreadful lullaby. But it wasn't just that. There was something more, a presence that lingered in the air, a feeling that the cemetery wasn't just a place of death, but something far more ancient and malicious, something that had kept Elizabeth trapped there for all these years, something that had no intention of letting go. A few weeks passed, and I couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. I returned to the cemetery, despite every instinct telling me to stay away. I needed answers, needed to know what had truly happened to Elizabeth, what kept her tethered to that cursed place. It was a crisp evening, the sun dipping behind the trees when I arrived. The air was heavy with a sense of inevitability. The cemetery was silent, almost too silent. I walked the familiar path, my feet leading me toward the same spot where I had seen her before, and there, among the overgrown graves, I found it. The grave that had been neglected, the one Elizabeth had lingered by. There was a name on the stone this time, one that hadn't been there before. Elizabeth Hawthorne, but the dates weren't right. The year of death, 1911. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Elizabeth hadn't just disappeared in 1974. Her ghost, her spirit, had been trapped in that cemetery long before, and as the shadows closed in, I understood. She wasn't the only one. The cemetery had been collecting souls, pulling them into its embrace, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me, too. The whispers of Soldiers' Ravine. In the early 1980s, something strange began, happening at Greenwood Cemetery, a place that had always been known for its somber beauty. It started with rumors, first from the occasional late-night wanderer, and then from more than one person in the town. They spoke of whispers, soft but distinct, coming from the ravine that ran through the cemetery's northern corner. At first, it was brushed off as the wind, or perhaps the creaking of old tombstones in the shifting earth. But as more and more people claimed to hear the whispers, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just the sound of wind or rustling leaves, it was something else. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to speak from deep below the ground. Those who had the courage to investigate late at night often reported hearing faint pleas for help, like the voice of someone trapped, their words weak and desperate. No one knew what to make of it, but the atmosphere around the ravine grew heavier, the air thicker with unease. Historians and archaeologists began to take notice, and after some digging through old town records, they uncovered a chilling discovery. During the Civil War, a skirmish had occurred not far from the cemetery grounds, and a number of soldiers, Union and Confederate, had been buried hastily in what was then a shallow ravine. In the chaos of battle, many of the soldiers had been mistakenly buried alive, some still moaning in their final moments, others clawing desperately at the earth in their last, agonizing attempts for freedom. The records were vague, but they told a tragic story. The soldiers were buried quickly, under the assumption that they were dead, only to be entombed in the cold earth while they were still very much alive. The discovery shook the town, and with it came an eerie sense of guilt that hung over the cemetery like a fog. The ravine, once a forgotten corner of the graveyard, had become a symbol of suffering, a place where the past had clawed its way back into the present. The more the historians dug into the past, the more they uncovered, each revelation darker than the last. The sounds that were now being heard from the ravine weren't just whispers. Local accounts began to mention strange noises that echoed through the cemetery at dusk. Faint, scraping sounds, like fingernails scratching desperately at the inside of a coffin. Those who dared to venture near the ravine after nightfall spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, a thick, suffocating air that seemed to cling to the skin. The whispers weren't just voices, they were pleading for help, their tone desperate, as though something unseen were trying to claw its way out. It wasn't long before people began to avoid that part of the cemetery altogether, convinced that whatever was trapped in the ravine had never truly been at rest. Some claimed to see shadows moving just beneath the earth's surface, while others would feel a cold, clammy breeze brush against their skin, though there was no wind. The cemetery, a place that had once been tranquil, had transformed into something much darker, much more unsettling. As the reports of strange occurrences continued to surface, the town became divided. Some people, eager to understand the cause of the eerie sounds, began visiting the ravine regularly, recording the whispers with old tape recorders. But what they caught on tape sent chills down their spines. The faint sounds of soldiers, their voices barely audible over the crackling static, could be heard clearly. Screams for mercy, pleas for help, mixed with unintelligible mutterings that seemed to call out for someone, anyone, to come and release them from their torment. Others, however, were not so eager to probe deeper into the mystery. They believed that some things were better left undisturbed, that whatever had happened in that ravine was best forgotten. But even they couldn't escape the whispers. They began hearing them in their homes, on quiet nights when the wind was still and the world seemed asleep. The eerie scratching sounds followed them, crawling up the walls like invisible fingers, tugging at their sanity. Something in that ravine wasn't ready to be left behind, and it seemed to be reaching out, growing stronger with each passing year. By the late 1980s, the cemetery had become a place of both fascination and fear. Tourists arrived in droves, eager to hear about the haunting whispers and the dark history of the ravine. Some came with recording devices, hoping to capture the sounds for themselves, while others simply stood at the edge of the ravine, staring down into the dark abyss, waiting for the whispers to return. Those who spent too long near the ravine spoke of feeling an oppressive weight pressing down on them, as though the very earth beneath them was alive, breathing, watching. People who had ventured too far into the ravine's depths were never the same afterward. They would leave the cemetery with ashen faces, their eyes wide and vacant, their mouths trembling as if they were still hearing those desperate cries. A few claimed they had heard more than just the whispers, voices, louder this time, calling their names, begging them to help, to set them free. Some even claimed to have seen figures, blurred in the corner of their eyes, moving under the soil, rising up from the depths of the earth. It was as if the soldiers, long dead, long forgotten, were reaching out, trying to make contact with the living once more. One night, a group of young men, emboldened by stories and alcohol, decided to venture into the ravine, hoping to prove the tales were nothing more than superstition. They laughed as they made their way past the tombstones, their voices echoing into the darkness. But as they reached the ravine, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. The whispers began, faint at first, and then more distinct, almost as if they were surrounding them. Panic set in. When one of them, a tall, confident guy named Mark, knelt down to examine the earth, he claimed to have heard the unmistakable sound of fingernails scraping beneath him. The others laughed nervously, dismissing it as a trick of the wind. But as Mark reached out to touch the ground, his hand trembled. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The whispers turned into frantic shouts, and before they could react, the earth beneath Mark gave way. The ground split open, and he disappeared, his screams echoing through the ravine, fading into an eerie silence. The remaining group fled, but when they returned with the authorities, Mark was nowhere to be found. The ravine was undisturbed, the whispers gone, as if Mark had never existed. The disappearance of Mark sent a ripple of fear through the town, but it wasn't just the locals who were shaken. The news outlets picked up the story, and soon the cemetery and its ravine became a point of fascination for paranormal investigators. But when they arrived to explore the site, they too were unnerved. Teams of experts, armed with state-of-the-art equipment, spent countless nights in the cemetery, hoping to capture something, anything, that would explain the whispers. But every time they set up their cameras, every time they placed their microphones near the ravine, the whispers would cease, only to start again when they left, fading into the night like a hidden secret. Those who managed to catch faint images on their recordings reported blurry figures moving beneath the soil, as if the dead were still trapped in the earth, forever trying to claw their way out. No one could explain it. No one knew how Mark had vanished, and no one could shake the feeling that something was still very much alive in the ravine, a force that had been waiting patiently for someone to listen. As the years wore on, the cemetery became less of a place for remembrance and more of a site for dread. The whispers persisted, their urgency growing with each passing year. Some people started claiming that the ravine was cursed, a place where the spirits of those soldiers were trapped, unable to rest, their souls tormented by their violent, unintended deaths. And then, as the 1990s came to a close, a new report surfaced, another disappearance. This time it was a young woman named Claire, a historian who had become fascinated by the ravine's dark past. She was last seen sitting at the edge of the ravine, her notebook in hand, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her last words, according to the man who had been with her, were a soft whisper. They want to tell their story. After that, she vanished. Her body was never found, but those who searched the ravine claimed to hear her voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the earth. The whispers, now louder than ever, seemed to be calling for someone to listen, to understand, and the more they called, the stronger the pull became. Greenwood Cemetery was no longer just a burial ground. It was a place where the past and present collided, where the dead were never truly gone, and where the whispers of Soldiers' Ravine would never cease. The photographer's curse. In 1998, Greenwood Cemetery had already earned its place as one of the most mysterious and unsettling locations in town. It was an old cemetery, the kind where the headstones leaned crookedly and moss had overtaken the forgotten graves. But it was also strangely beautiful in its decay. Overgrown paths winding through dense trees, the haunting silence broken only by the occasional bird or the distant hum of traffic. Lucas Reed, an amateur photographer with a love for capturing abandoned places, was drawn to the cemetery one evening. His goal wasn't to chase ghosts or legends, but rather to immortalize the eerie beauty of the cemetery at twilight. Armed with a vintage camera and a passion for the forgotten, he ventured into the cemetery that summer night, unaware that the photographs he was about to take would lead to something far more sinister. It was a few days later that Lucas developed the role of film. At first, everything seemed normal. Pictures of weathered gravestones, forgotten flowers, and the dense shadows of trees that stretched long under the setting sun. But as he examined the photographs more closely, something caught his eye. In one shot, a strange mist swirled around a gravestone that he hadn't noticed before. In another, a faint figure seemed to loom in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, with no explanation for how it had gotten there. Lucas was confused at first. He thought maybe the lens had fogged up, or that it was a trick of the light. But the longer he looked, the more he noticed. Faces, distorted, gaunt faces, appeared in several of the images, faces that shouldn't have been there. He brushed it off as a trick of photography, but deep down, something stirred within him. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the cemetery after all. The following week, Lucas went back to the cemetery, his curiosity piqued by the unsettling photographs. He brought a new roll of film, determined to uncover the source of the strange images. This time, he came equipped with more gear, an old flash, his most trusted camera, and a tape recorder to document any unusual sounds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he set up his equipment near the old wrought-iron gate, feeling a cold shiver crawl up his spine despite the warm summer air. His camera clicked away, capturing the fading light and the strange shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the cemetery grounds. But then something happened, something that would change everything. As Lucas was about to take a shot near a particularly old grave, the camera malfunctioned. The flash went off by itself, and a strange, high-pitched sound filled the air, almost like a hum, followed by a deep, unsettling silence. He looked around, feeling a sudden, inexplicable unease. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong. When Lucas reviewed the photos he had taken that night, he found that the camera had malfunctioned in an even stranger way. In each shot, something appeared that shouldn't have been there. Shadows, dark and thick, twisted in ways that defied logic. Figures that couldn't be human, their outlines warped and distorted, hovered just outside the frame. But the most disturbing thing was in one particular photograph. A face, faint but unmistakable, appeared just over his shoulder, staring straight into the lens. Lucas couldn't remember anyone being near him at the time he'd taken the photo. He froze when he saw it. Something about that face unsettled him in a way that words couldn't describe. It was a face he didn't recognize, one that seemed to stare at him with an unblinking intensity, as if it were aware of him, of his every movement. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. The image haunted him. It was as if the cemetery, or whatever lingered, there was calling to him. The following days passed uneventfully, but Lucas found it harder and harder to shake the feeling that something was following him. He chalked it up to his overactive imagination. After all, he had always been a little paranoid. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. It started small. His camera, which had always worked perfectly before, began malfunctioning. The lens would fog up without reason, the shutter would jam, and at times it would refuse to turn on at all. Then the nightmares began. Lucas dreamed of being in the cemetery, the gravestones looming like sentinels around him. He would hear whispers, soft at first, but growing louder as the dream progressed. The whispers were unintelligible, but they seemed to be calling his name. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the sound of those whispers still ringing in his ears. He couldn't explain it, but the connection between the cemetery and the nightmares felt undeniable. It wasn't long before Lucas's friends started to notice a change in him. He became withdrawn, more anxious. He would talk about the cemetery, about the strange faces in his photos, but the more he spoke, the more distant he became. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The cemetery, the figures, the whispers that seemed to follow him. It was as if the very act of photographing the place had cursed him. One evening, Lucas decided to return to Greenwood Cemetery one last time. He had to know what was happening. He set up his camera, determined to capture something that would explain it all, something that would give him peace. But as the night wore on, and the cemetery seemed to grow colder, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't just in his head. He could hear them clearly, soft and faint, as if coming from all around him. And when he turned his camera toward an old mausoleum in the distance, he saw something in the viewfinder, something that wasn't there before. It was the same face, that same haunting face, staring back at him. The moment Lucas snapped the photo, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. A sharp pain shot through his chest, as if something had gripped his heart and squeezed. He dropped the camera, clutching his chest, gasping for air. His vision blurred and he stumbled back, falling to the ground. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever had been trapped in the cemetery was now trying to reach him, to drag him into the depths with it. His mind raced as he realized what was happening. It was no longer just the cemetery. It was as if the very act of capturing its essence, of bringing its dark history into focus, had awakened something ancient, something vengeful. Lucas struggled to his feet, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. He tried to run, but his body refused to cooperate. As the night grew darker, the last thing Lucas saw was the figure of a man standing just beyond the gate of the cemetery. His face was obscured, but the unmistakable sense of malevolence that radiated from him was clear. And then, everything went black. The news of Lucas's death hit the town hard. It was ruled as a tragic car accident, a sudden and unexplained crash on a quiet country road. His friends and family were left in shock, unable to understand how someone so full of life could be taken so suddenly. But the town, the locals who had always whispered about the cemetery, knew better. They had seen it before. the misfortune that seemed to follow those who dared to disturb the peace of Greenwood Cemetery. His death, like the malfunctioning cameras and distorted photos, was part of a pattern. Lucas Reed had become another victim of the photographer's curse, a curse that claimed anyone who sought to capture the cemetery's dark secrets. The town tried to move on, but it wasn't long before the whispers began again. They had always been there, lurking just beyond the reach of the living, waiting for someone else to dare to photograph the cursed cemetery. Soon, a few brave souls ventured into the cemetery, some with cameras, others simply out of curiosity, hoping to test the warnings. But those who did found themselves met with the same strange phenomenon. Cameras malfunctioned, batteries drained in seconds, and photos came out distorted, showing faces that shouldn't have been there. Faces twisted with pain and anguish, eyes wide with terror, staring back at the photographer as if begging for release. Some, even, reported strange shadows following them home, shadows that would flicker at the edges of their vision, never fully materializing but always present, lurking just outside the frame. The more they tried to erase the photos, the more the spirits seemed to grow stronger. People whispered that those who defied the curse would be followed by the restless souls of the cemetery, and that the more they tried to escape it, the closer they would come to the darkness that lingered just beyond the veil. There was one, however, who refused to heed the warnings. A young photographer, Alex, determined to prove that the curse was nothing more than superstition, decided to take his own set of photos in the cemetery, hoping to capture the truth. Armed with nothing but his camera and a sense of skepticism, he entered the cemetery at dusk, laughing off the warnings that had kept others away. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long over the gravestones, Alex began to feel the weight of the place, its oppressive silence, the way the air seemed to change. He clicked his camera, and as he reviewed the images later, he saw what the others had seen. Distorted faces, grotesque figures lurking in the corners of his shots. And then, in one image, Alex saw something he hadn't expected, a shadow standing right behind him, its face obscured, but its presence undeniable. In that instant, the realization hit him. The curse was real, and now he too was part of it. Alex's life began to unravel in ways he couldn't explain. His camera, once a tool for creativity, had become a device of torment. Every time he took a photograph, the distortion grew worse, the shadows more pronounced. Strange figures began appearing in his life, figures that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He couldn't escape them. His friends noticed his increasing paranoia, the way he would stare off into the distance, as if waiting for something to appear. The whispers grew louder in his mind. Always. There, always just out of reach. Alex tried everything to rid himself of the curse, destroying the photographs, leaving the town, even abandoning his camera. But nothing worked. The curse had taken hold, and with each passing day, it grew stronger. He was now just another victim of Greenwood Cemetery, another soul trapped in its curse, doomed to join the restless dead. The story of Lucas Reed's curse lives on, passed from one generation to the next, a warning for anyone who dares to capture the dark beauty of Greenwood Cemetery. The camera, once a tool of art, has become a symbol of misfortune, a device that brings more than just memories. And for those who still test the cemetery's power, the whispers remain, faint but undeniable, always beckoning, always waiting. Some say the faces in the photographs are just illusions, tricks of the light, or reflections of the mind. But the locals know better, and as the years go on, one thing becomes clear. The photographer's curse isn't just about what's caught on film. It's about what follows you home, what lingers in the darkness, just beyond the frame, waiting for its next victim.